Hi everyone. This is a quick discussion as part of a series called the Standard Discussion. I did talk in previous videos and previous sessions about, how there is multiple groups in the standard community. Some of them are building products like the folks that are building the OData Neo and the OpenAI. Some people are doing research. Some people are doing, just kind of quick kind of research on particular topics and particular issues. And this one here is, think of it as the think tank for the standard community, right? This is where we bring, people from the community to talk about how we develop software, what kind of architecture are we following, certain concerns, certain patterns that happen, while we're developing systems, and, what does that mean, for the future implementations, so we kind of bring that kind of influence into the products and the services that we build. And from there, we start kind of evolving the standard. So it's not always, it's not written in stone. It's not something that memorize and you follow for the rest of your life. No, it's not like that at all. It doesn't, the standard doesn't respect tradition. It respects, innovation and change and all that. And as usual, my dear friend here, Christo, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well, thanks, Hassan.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you. So Crystal, I know you have a couple of topics, and I put them kind of, on the title of this, pure contracts and, talking about default values for models. Can you go a little bit over, the question? What are we discussing today, and, why is that important and all that? Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So we saw the OpenAI video, the session that you guys had earlier, and
Hmm.
just one of the things that sort of I came to mind was why aren't we looking at a pure contract for the broker?
Hmm. Hmm.
Something like uh, a class that encapsulate the response and the request.
Hmm.
So that was one question that I sort just thought about, and the next one was the comment that Brian said on the default values that should be in the foundation server. So I thought it'd be nice to just touch on that
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
people that doesn't or aren't that familiar with the documentation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So
Yeah.
let's bring people up first to what purity of contract is and why the standard enforces that rule. And then we will talk a little bit further about, what means for us and all that. So let's just go to the standard first. The standard, here it is. And let's go to pure contract. Pure primitive. There it is. This is in the foundation services for a reason. And what this principle basically talks about, this characteristic, it says broker neighboring services are not allowed to combine multiple primitive operations to achieve higher order business logic. Okay, no, this is for that. For instance, broker neighbors say, okay, we're talking about primitive operations, but also there is a part here. No, this is about the operation, but there's also pure contract. Let's see here if I can find this one. Contract, physical and virtual, dependency contract, single contract, right? The characteristic comes out of the box, single dependency rule. If services can only serve and receive one contract, then the same rule applies to controllers. Then they can return a contract. So we're talking about the one, when we say contract and model, we're talking about the same thing. But I think there is one also that is more, hold on. I think I call it pure primitive, pure dependency contracts, pure mapping. Let's see here. This is on the exposure layer, and then we're gonna go, wow, we do have a lot of topics in here. Let's see, non-local models, exceptions, dependencies, validations, on the foundation, do or delegate, single exposure point, same or primitive. Let's see, I think this is it. All services must maintain, there it is, that's the one. So what this principle basically says is that all services must maintain a single contract regarding the return and input types, except if they are primitives. This actually should be called if they are primitives or natives, because we still like a list or an iQueryable is not a primitive contract, but it's native. It's native to the to the framework that we're working with,
Yeah.
right? For instance, a service that provides operations for an entity of type student should not be returning any from any of its methods from any other entity type. You may return an aggregation of the same entity, like a list of student, or aggregated students models, or a primitive type like getting student count or a boolean indicating whether a student exists or not, but not any other non-primitive or non-aggregating contract. A similar rule applies to input parameters. Any service may receive an input parameter of the same contract, virtual aggregation contract, or a primitive type, but not any other contract. To simplify this, just to kind of bring things, into focus here, what I'm basically saying is that you will see some craziness that happens. This is how you know you kind of violated the standard and you started going down the spiral of, writing code that's non-maintainable. If you Let's just assume that you have some service here called student service like this, right? And you want to go here and say, well, I want to add student async and or register student, right? That's totally fine, right? But sometimes you'll find people saying, oh, teacher, right? And retrieve a student teacher async, right? And maybe pass the student ID in here, student ID. Now you're starting to know that you're starting to make things a little bit more complicated because this is a student service. It's a foundation service. It's supposed to honor one contract, so it's only operating with one contract, right? But now you're starting to add in other contracts, which basically means that you're starting to kind of literally create spaghetti code because
Mm.
now you have one service and it's talking to 50 different models and it doesn't have its own independent, kind of contract that it's working with. In fact, there are a group of people, that I worked with at some point in time, they kind of diverged a little bit from the standard by saying even if the service upstream is just a pass through, it needs to have its own model. But that's extreme. That's a little bit too much work. So they would go and say, if you have a student service and a student processing service and a student orchestration service like this, they want to create a contract for each and every one of those. So this will have student model, this will have, I don't know, student processing model, and this will have student orchestration model. And that's not okay because there's no need for it. You're only working with the same contract. We may at some point in time find something around this. We may at some point in time find true independence for every service based on, the values that they're working with and whatnot. But this is extreme. We don't do that.
Mm.
Now, here's the problem though. This rule only applies to services and exposers, but it doesn't apply to brokers. At least not yet.
Yeah.
Brokers that are married with a SPAL component will definitely need to apply the pure contract kind of mindset. I
Yeah.
agree. Brokers that are working directly with external libraries, you just can't. I'll give you an example. Imagine you're going and saying your broker, just like this OpenAI broker, right? It's taking in a completion. It returns a completion response, and we're saying post completion request async, but it's actually taken a completion request as a parameter like this, like this. So now we have a problem, right? Because now you're basically saying that you're working with multiple kind of models in here.
Yeah.
Someone brought this once, Chris. I think it's probably you. Someone brought the idea of, well, as long as it's within the same domain, it's still single responsibility. But especially at the foundation service level, you're working with primitive operations. I don't know if I buy that, but I'd like to hear your thought on this.
No, that makes sense. I think my thought was also based on brokers coupled to spell. So
Hmm.
so I think in that sense, I wanted to see what the thoughts are around the pure contracts on brokers. Uh,
100% with you if they're married to Spal, because that you're
mhm.
just a continuation of you're basically just a continuation of the a standardized system. I see
Yeah.
Muhammad here saying hi. Hey Muhammad, how are you? Okay, so I don't know how many people are watching. I think StreamYard is broken, but there are people watching, obviously. Go ahead, tell me. So if the case, if you're working with SPAL, if you're working with SPAL component, let's just go back here.
So I know we said in OpenAI we're going to target different AIs potentially in the future. So I think that's where the thinking
Right,
started.
right.
I would definitely start, but I also know that we've not quite finalized spell yet.
Yes. So external library like this, a broker that's working like this with a foundation service, look at the impact of chaos. But we eventually we bring it down back to a a good point. A broker like this, all of this is red, all of this is chaos, and then you're still chaos all the way down to this last minute of detail in here. So half of this is chaos and half of this is actually standardization. And then moving forward from there, you're only working with standardized. So this is your service in here. This is your foundation service. And then moving forward from there, you're only working with, if this is a processing service or whatever the case may be. Just a second.
Mm.
Just a moment. So, so let's see. This is a processing service or whatever service that's upstream for that. It could be an orchestration service, whatever the case may be. This here is the non-SPAL reality.
Yeah.
With SPAL, it's completely different because with SPAL, you can basically go and say, no, actually, all of this is green, including this one, but internally, inside that SPAL library, you have that exact same model in here, which is this one. Like inside the SPAL library, you have this part in here. So what
Yeah.
this, you get the point, right? So, I'm just hoping that people kind of understand. I know you do. I'm just trying to kind of clarify it to people that, underneath all of this, you are basically working with a system that was designed to abstract away that chaos, right? So that means every domain system that will use this utility system is not going to have to be influenced by chaos in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
That's the trick, at least as far as we see it, as far as we understand it. That's the trick. If I go and say, let me move this a little bit further, this is supposed to be outside of the spell library. That's just something that we're abstracting away. And then if you look at, if we move service, I need to make this as clear as possible, so forgive my ADHD there. This is your exposure layer, expo exposure. And this guy is coming up in here, and I'm taking these two, copy, paste, bring these down here, and then give me this one as well. Here we go. And that's your exposure layer, and that exposure layer is basically all green like that,
Yeah.
right? So now that's your external library. That's what it's contained of. That's why we're saying it's standardized. Now, some people are gonna then tell me, Hassan, why the service itself internally has half red and half green? Because the service is the one mapping from these external models and non-pure models into a pure model. And I wanted to actually run this by you. What I'm basically saying is that when we go to a foundation service, we're gonna end up basically doing something like this. So your foundation service is gonna be called a completion, post completion async, and you're posting a completion like this. And what this completion model will be, it's going to be something that looks like this. So inside that model, it will basically always will have the request, the response, and whatever the case may be, whatever
Yeah.
is on top of that. What do you think?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
So that means people are dealing with completion all the
Mm,
time. You know, there's a request and a response, a
mm,
virtual model that's, well, it's not, well, it is virtual because it never gets persisted as is, but that virtual model is basically what's going to work. That's going to be probably 99% of the work that we'll be doing in OpenAI. We're basically picking up the chaos and bringing it down to a point where we can actually standardize it. So the people that will be consuming this library, their expectations are very, very clear and very, very pure. And just for the people wondering why that hard rule, because it doesn't make sense that you put an apple in a fridge or a microwave and pull it back out as an orange. It just it's nonsense. It
mm.
doesn't make any sense to me. Okay. So that at least that kind of wraps up that piece, at least. That kind of takes care of, this piece, right?
Yeah,
Okay. Do you think this piece is worthy to be documented in the standard in the brokers section at least?
yeah. I think we can make a distinction between when you're just consuming a client versus a spell.
Sounds good.
Um, I think we can potentially also add a bit more of rules on our spell documentation,
Yes.
um, because I think we said when we start looking at spell, we're always going to pass in uh, a, a, a dynamic type or type T generic
Mm-hmm.
type.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to look at things like that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we sort of ended off at last session where we discussed the exception handling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and Monk has also started the conversation on Discord a few days ago where we sort of had the same idea about um, inheriting from a base exception so that we can distinguish what kind of type that is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think we're close on spell, finishing that off.
Good.
Um, I think the biggest thing that I need to get my head around, I don't know if you've got any ideas around that yet, is how that dynamic mapping will work. So I think if I think of a storage broker in the first instance, um, it's quite easy to move your migrations and stuff to a separate library.
Ah,
But my headache comes in as where do you do that fluent configuration? Your fluent configuration will sort of get lost the moment you make that external. So
unless Chris, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead first. Finish first. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah,
Mhm.
so my thinking of the current spell implementation is you've got your domain model
Mhm.
of student. Um, we then do a dynamic mapping to an external model.
Mhm.
And somewhere we need to do that migration and uh, fluent configuration and uh, translation to an external model that will be used for your storage broker.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
I can't quite see how you set up your DB sets yet with the storage broker. And with the box I've worked on so far, I've had a known uh, entity on
Mhm.
my spell. So um, upstream and downstream need to conform to the type that I've declared on the spell abstraction.
Yep.
But I think it yeah. I think
So,
that bit to do the dynamic mapping is quite difficult if you think you're coming in from your domain model with a specific model, and then if you have a send grid or something like that underneath to marrying the properties up together.
so one thing that comes to mind, here's one for you. Um, I thought about to make it a part of SPAL that the library would still be able to expose you to the core component. So what I mean by that is that your SPAL library will be able to go and say, um, here is an example. Your SPAL library needs to be able to go and say something to the effect of, here is my public interface iSpal. So something is implementing that, right? And inside that spell, you have the void add, t, whatever, whatever the case may be. But also there should be something in here that says, object get native provider. So this way we're saying, hey, if you know what you're doing and you're willing to take the risk of interacting directly with the entity framework instead of working with SPAL on the top, I will give you the native provider to do whatever you want with it. What do you think about that?
That's interesting. Yeah.
So this way, this is basically, think about this as our kind of backwards compatibility, or our way of basically going and saying, hey, I still want you to be able to um, interact with the thing that you're familiar with, even if SPAL is not giving you that contract. I'm still gonna go ahead and give you the native provider, hey Paul, that kind of gives you that ability to
Mm.
interact with that system, right?
Yeah, and the responsibility of the mapping will still sit in the spell then.
It should.
Yeah, because
It
we don't
should.
want any changes to our foundation services if we swap spell components.
Exactly. We can't. If you are using a SPAL library and a switch, ideally, this is the kicker, right? If you are working with a SPAL library and you have to switch between a SQL to Oracle to MySQL to a local storage, and you are changing more than just a configuration, something is wrong.
Hmm.
Then SPAL has failed, because the whole idea is to go and say, hey, big corporate enterprise, hey, people that are writing paychecks for millions of dollars, we want to switch a technology because we think that, sometimes in bigger corporates, they wouldn't do the switch to a cheaper technology because of the cost of the migration outweighs the
Hmm.
cost of the payment.
It's
But
Yeah.
been
what
there.
if we made that switch a configuration? Go ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I see it all the time. I see, like a lot of clients that we deal with,
Mm-hmm.
Fortune 500 clients, they're
Mm-hmm.
sitting there saying, hey, why should we use your product? And you explain to them all the value in the product, and they go, great. So what's it going to cost us to get on board?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And as soon as you explain to them any kind of, oh, well, you're going to need to do this, and it's going to take you weeks, to onboard somehow or migrate stuff from whatever you've got into our system, that's
Mm-hmm.
it. The discussion ends. But if you go to a third party, if you go to that same client and you say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, all you got to do is send us what you've got, and
Mm-hmm.
there's no other work, and we deal with it all straight away. That's a selling point. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and it's particularly bad for the like the biggest companies, right? So
Yep.
I mentioned Fortune 500 companies, and a lot of the reasoning behind that is
Mm-hmm.
if you've got if you've got a company that's that big, the company is not just one what they call a legal entity, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's made up of essentially a tree of companies.
Mm-hmm.
So that thing that we think of as Microsoft is not just Microsoft. It's lots of little companies all the way around the world.
Subsidiaries, all these little companies, all the GitHubs and LinkedIn's and all the little. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So when you sell a product to Microsoft, and Microsoft's looking at, okay, what are all the companies that I need to roll this out to, and what's the individual project cost of rolling it out to each of those companies? As soon as they start seeing the costs stack up, because to do it to one of them is, I don't know, X number of zeros, and you have to stack that Y number of times, it just becomes prohibitively expensive, and it just kills your product there and then. So
So
yeah,
so now I'm hearing even more good things about SPAL, because it doesn't just allow you to run your entire stack locally without having to rely on the cloud, right? So it's cloud foreign rather than cloud native. It's also better for the business because every time the business finds a cheaper alternative, the switch over to that cheaper alternative will be as small as a configuration change, assuming that this business follows the standard and applies things according to the standard, of course, which is a cost that they need to bear anyway if they want to maintain their system and people be interested into building their code. But then there's the third part about this, which is us being able to open up a marketplace for providers that are not just locked in because of the difficulty and the complexity of the integration, but rather true competition based on quality and cost. So if Paul is spinning up a SQL server today that's 10 times cheaper than Oracle, he should have a fair shot and not be blocked just because getting away from Oracle is too complicated. That's not fair. Like, imagine you're basically selling a product and it's like this disease that's stuck to you and you just can't pull it out nicely simply because the software itself is built in a way that makes it impossible. Like one of these SAP systems, the SAP systems and stuff like that. Once you're in, you're in. You're dead, right? So I think that's a great advantage as well. I think that's yeah, people could benefit from something like that for sure. Okay.
Yeah, and I think SAP is a great example because
Mm-hmm.
the issue that I see with SAP is like, and similar systems like it is once you get into it, what they're selling you is not really a finished product. Think of it as like what they're selling you in our ecosystem would be .NET. They're not selling you
Mm-hmm.
some application built on .NET. They're selling you the framework,
Mm-hmm.
and into that you build your solution. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're building a product that needs to integrate with many instances of something like SAP, you need to make damn sure that no matter what they did with it, you can just plug in and life is easy.
Right, right, right. Okay, so the proposal here are Christo, our way out, or at least this is my idea about this, is to basically go and say, in addition to the primitive operations that you want to offer, also give people access to the native or primitive model. Paul, ideas? Paul, how caught up are you on SPAL?
So we're talking about abstraction providers, right? So
Yeah.
we're going to have, presumably in the standard, we're going to say, okay, here's some abstraction layer that represents, I don't know, one example that Microsoft already has is for dependency injection. They have an abstraction for that, and then they have
Mm-hmm.
implementations of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
dependency injection. So my thinking is that, like, if we took something like, well, take your example of databases, right?
Mm-hmm.
To some degree, Entity Framework is kind of like a SPAL provider of sorts, right? If you write
Mm-hmm.
all your code against EF, but imagine
Mm-hmm.
you're building something like a content management system, say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You use EF for your back end. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to say to people that are consuming your content management stack and building their own application on top of that, they can just change some config settings. They might have to get, say, a different NuGet package, you know, a SQL one versus an Oracle one or something.
Mm-hmm.
But that's it. You know, there's no more to it. Like the system just knows how to like build out that database structure. And if you want to migrate from some old instance that you've got of the same thing in Oracle to your new SQL one, that should
Mm-hmm.
be built into your implementation as well,
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
my view. But I think at that point you're talking about sort of API layers. So when you talk about like native types, are you talking about like what do we consider native in this context?
The native provider is that I'll tell you, like in your SPAL, you have iSPAL like this. This is my SPAL, and this is, let's say entity framework SPAL, something like that. Okay?
Okay.
And what's basically happening is that if you go and say SPAL dot get native provider like this, that will give you actually the context, the EF core context, which is what SPAL is trying to abstract away from you in the first place.
Then I would say no. So
Mm-hmm.
the whole point of SPAL is for us to not worry about that thing, or whoever's consuming SPAL shouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
worried about how it's implemented under the bonnet. Think of it much like in our code, we
Mhm.
define an interface and then we
Mhm.
implement the interface. The details of the implementation, the private methods that are in
Mhm.
that thing that's implementing the interface, you
Mhm.
shouldn't have to care about, right? All
Mhm.
you care about is interacting with something that implements that interface. And I think the same should be true of SPAL, is that
But wait. What if the provider is offering additional capabilities that are not always in all other providers?
lowest common denominator, I would say. I'd say make them all fall in line, because the SPAL interface should be the functionality that's needed. So let's say I have a SPAL that defines CRUD, right?
Mm, mm,
I'm saying, okay, I've got a CRUD SPAL thing, and CRUD can be provided by EF talking to Microsoft SQL, or
mm,
EF talking to Oracle, or
mhm, mhm,
Dapper,
mhm,
or raw ADO, or some API that gets called out to. It doesn't matter. What I care about and what I'm pulling into my project is a dependency on some CRUD provider.
mhm,
So if that thing can do stuff beyond CRUD, cool, great. But for the purpose of this SPAL implementation, it's not needed. Potentially, though, the implementation might be able to optimize certain things.
mhm.
So, those extra features being in that thing might help if you like, the implementation of the thing
That's what I'm
behind the
saying.
interface. Yeah.
Right.
But that should all be behind the SPAL. It shouldn't be something that I have to send up through the chain. But I think there's the onus on there for us to get the interface right at the SPAL level. So, like, if we're defining iCRUD, do
Mm,
we define, for example, it would make sense, for example, to define the whole CRUD interface as, asynchronous, as, returning async
right.
operations, because we know that, for example, HTTP calls are going to be asynchronous. Some database providers, like, for example, Cosmos, is running over a HTTP request to the API. And actually, there's some efficiency gains to be gained at the systemic level in terms of resourcing by making everything asynchronous. So there's some value there, right? Even though EF, for example, can do things synchronously, particularly for GET requests on queries. But we would have to consider, for example, the impact of that, right? So,
Right.
like, can we do link things with an asynchronous iQueryable? Or
Right.
do we need to expose somehow in that, in the GET, for example, we expose some ability, I can't believe I'm going to say this, to pass in an OData query string. So behind that, they can pull in the OData Neo library that we've been building.
Mhm.
And that's how they would consume EF from that point. It would take in the raw OData string,
Mhm.
behind the interface or something, and then consume that to build out the queryables. I don't know.
Well, you have to know, Paul, like, okay,
Yeah.
imagine that you have Dapper and the entity framework sitting behind a SPAL component.
Mhm.
Okay? So you're basically working like this. Here is a diagram, and you are basically going and saying, here's my SPAL component, and I have EF sitting as a provider in one place and Dapper sitting as a provider in another place. You understand me? So
Yep.
here's EF and here's Dapper, right? Obviously, there are things that EF can do that Dapper can't,
Yep.
and vice versa. There could be something that Dapper is really, I'd love to know what it is, but as let's just assume for the heck of it that, Entity Framework has this capability, but Dapper has this other capability, right?
So
Un
I
hang on,
mentioned I
hang
mentioned
on.
OData there, and I think that's a good example.
Just wait, just wait.
Yeah.
So now this is your consumer. Your broker is sitting right here, and your broker is talking directly to SPAL, which is all good. This is all good stuff, right? However, sometimes you want to kind of call, let's say, for instance, a stored procedure,
Okay.
or you want to do this fluent setup of relationships of tables before migration. In Dapper, this is done in a very particular way that doesn't necessarily match, and you can't find the common denominator there. There's no such a thing. You won't be able to find it. For instance, in Entity Framework, they have something called no tracking. I don't want to track the items. Don't track the items. In here in Dapper, because it's literally just communicating SQL, it has no concept of tracker. So unless you go and say, hey, I'm going to actually, in addition to these capability, I'm going to expose the native provider, and I'm gonna let you take the responsibility, if you want to, of dealing with it, which means you're gonna have to change some code if you decide to switch to a different provider. This way, we're holding the stick from the middle because we're telling people, hey, you don't have to handle different exceptions. You don't have to do different configurations. And yet, we're also giving them the opportunity in advanced scenarios where they can go and leverage a provider-specific capabilities that is not necessarily a common denominator for the SPAL component.
See, I'd go the other way. I'd say I'd define the SPAL interface, and I'd say this is what we can expect from the interface, and these are the set of exceptions that are allowed to pass over that interface.
Right, that's
and,
there. Okay.
And everything else is a problem behind that SPAL interface that the broker should never know about. All it should ever know about is SPAL, because that's the whole point of an interface, right?
Okay. Let me try this way. You want to set no tracking.
Yeah.
Your provider is the entity framework. You found the entity framework SPAL implementation, and you want to say no tracking. How do you do that?
You don't, because not all implementations of your SPAL thing are going to have that capability.
Right.
That's what I was
So
saying
what do you
earlier.
do?
It's a lowest common denominator thing, right? So think of a real world example, right? So what I was talking about earlier, like a content management system, right? So let's say I'm exposing a SPAL implementation that gives me all the functionality that would be needed to expose effectively a data layer for a content management system. I can define the interfaces in such a way at the SPAL level that it doesn't matter if EF has this additional functionality over Dapper. Because what I care about is content management. What I don't care about is database management. You see?
Yeah, I almost think I'm thinking the same as Paul. I think your spell should have your set interface contracts and stuff, and then on your provider you can through DI pass in your configuration, like the node tracking and things like that. But I still can't see how you set up your Fluent configurations to.
You won't be able to.
No.
Right. Right. You will not be able to.
I mean, nothing stops you having like an initialize method in your SPAL interface. So if you need to do things like, for example, run database migrations, what initialize does is somewhat irrelevant. But that could be part of the documented, hey, whenever you're using SPALs or this particular kind of SPAL, you have to call this thing to make sure everything is properly initialized.
But it could be type specific. Like you basically want to go and say, well, I want the database to automatically generate an ID for me, or every time I insert that object. You're gonna hit a lot of these scenarios, right? Go ahead.
So consider my scenario, right, where I said, the interface that we're exposing is for content management. So I want to do something like create a page, right? So what the SPAL interface is going to define is CRUD for pages.
Right.
How that CRUD specifically happens, and the fact that EF can do change tracking is somewhat irrelevant. I can assume at the broker level that's talking to that SPAL that nothing is change tracked because I'm following the standard anyway.
Yeah.
So by default, the way that we implement standardized stacks on top of this stuff is we don't want to use change tracking, because that's by design how, you know, the standard's supposed to work, right? So in theory, my SPAL implementation, being standard compliant, should ignore change tracking entirely for EF. It
No,
should
no, no. But
create,
you're talking. That's not the point. You're talking about the specific issue.
yeah,
I'm talking in general. This is just an analogy, an example,
right,
right? I'm
okay,
talking in general. Like there are places where you want to actually execute and go and say, ensure database exists.
yeah.
Dapper doesn't care about that. Entity framework does, because they're fundamentally different.
So if my SPAL interface that I'm exposing is, this is a data store for content management stuff.
Mm,
One place I will store that stuff is like a SQL server. Another place would be like a file system, for example,
mm,
right?
mm, mm.
So I could expose on the interface some initialize method, and in the database scenario, initialize will call all the database migrations and ensure that the database exists.
Mm.
In the file system scenario, it might just go and make sure that there's a root folder defined with some defined hierarchy of subfolders in it.
Right.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So different implementation, but it's the same principle. So what I'm getting at is the fact that like EF can do change tracking is irrelevant in one of those scenarios, right? Because the other one is just talking to a file system.
Right.
So, but the change tracking piece is not important. The functionality that SPAL is giving us through its the SPAL interface is what's important.
Mm.
Are you envisaging a scenario where you've got like a SPAL interface and you're saying, well, there might be something specific to the implementation that I want to expose?
You have to. You have to give
If,
yourself that way out. Otherwise, you'll get killed. Like imagine if you go to a company where they have the entity framework calling certain stored procedures. You know how the entity framework pulls in stored procedures into your code. If you try to do something like that, you know, you'll be dead very fast. Like entity framework now has hundreds and hundreds of features. And if
yeah,
you just hide it behind the spell and you're basically saying, no, I'm just going to give you the primitive operations.
yeah, but
You,
the
like,
thing is,
mhm, mhm,
right, what you're saying is, okay, I've got SQL Server, right? There is stuff that SQL Server can do that EF can't.
right.
Okay, I've got EF, right?
Mm,
Okay, there's stuff that EF can do that my SPAL implementation that I care about can't.
can't. Exactly.
Okay, I've got my SPAL implementation, right?
Yep.
Okay, the application that I'm building on top of that, there's stuff that the SPAL implementation can do, but the application doesn't care about. Do you see what I mean?
I,
It's a stack,
so,
and
hold tight,
think
hold
of
tight.
it like a triangle, like this, like a pyramid, right? There's a
Hang on, hang on. Let's say today we have these ASP.NET Core APIs.
yeah,
And we have a bunch of things that we implemented. For instance, I enable temporal tables.
sure,
Let's say I enable temporal tables, right? That's a functionality that you can do code first in Entity Framework.
yeah.
Are you with me? So your SPAL is saying, okay, here's your CRUD operations and go ahead and implement those and we're done. Great. But I also want to add temporal tables.
So
Yeah.
why not have
Uh-huh.
as part of the SPAL implementation,
Uh-huh.
you can, I don't know, maybe you have optionally change tracking or something as another part of the.
If you make it in SPAL, you're gonna implement 500 different features. Like your interface will be unbearable, and you're gonna force other providers to just implement all of these and say not implemented exception, not implemented exception, because your SPAL interface now is not just add and get native. Now you have some craziness like, you know, add temporal tables, right? And you need to go tables and you need to go figure out how you want to implement that in Dapper. Dapper doesn't care. It just doesn't offer you this feature.
yeah, I guess the way that I'm looking at it is the thing that I care about is what the SPAL interface is exposing, which is why I'm using the SPAL thing in the first place. If I wanted access to all of that lower level functionality that EF offers me, I would just use EF directly. So what's the value of SPAL?
The value of it is that if you decide like upwards from that SPAL component upwards, all the exceptions that will be thrown, all the models that you will be working with, everything else will never change. Like impact on the foundation services, today this is the state of foundation service. Let me just show you.
But
Foundation service, hang on.
that's not true if you expose the EF object under
It,
that, right?
it is, and I'll tell you why. I mean, 50% it is, 50% it's not. And I'll tell you why. Today, this is the state of our world, right? We go and pull in entity framework.
Yeah.
And then you have a storage broker. And your foundation service still has that half read because it's handling entity framework specific exceptions. It's dealing with entity framework specific models. For instance, your foundation service is still working with something like SQL exception.
Yeah.
Another example would be your foundation service is still dealing with DB update exception, right? Like that. What we want to do, even if you bring that native provider, it may produce exceptions that you don't expect, but only at the configuration level, not at the action level. Because the action level is already implemented by SPAL. You will never handle this. It will always be storage failure exception. Always. And they have to map that to all of that. So whether you're using Entity Framework or Dapper, you will continue, like this guy will turn green because this guy doesn't care anymore what you're actually using underneath. True abstraction.
So this is where there's some differences between how you do things and the standard is documented and how I do things. So I've drawn a line and I've said, okay, my broker interfaces exist one-to-one with a relationship with my foundations.
Mm-hmm.
So I define an entity and I say, okay, this has a foundation service
Mm-hmm.
and there's a related broker interface.
Mm-hmm.
And behind that broker, stuff's going to happen. And all I'm expecting to get back from it is my internal model.
Okay.
The piece that I haven't quite fully figured out is this piece around exception handling, right? So if the thing behind the broker throws a SQL exception,
what are you going to do?
For reasons of the standard tells me that broker down, I'm not allowed to put any business logic.
You can't, yes.
I can't put any kind of translational exception handling in there. If I put a SPAL in there, then I've got behind the broker business logic.
Which is a subsystem, and that's okay.
Yeah, so this is what I've been just trying to figure out, but I've been doing it without SPAL. So what I did was, like in the particular case of EF, right, we have to define a DB context. No matter how we look at it, a DB context is never going to be standard compliant unless we can somehow magically cause the EF team to just rewrite the whole of EF to suit the standard. Well, that's just not going to happen, right?
Someday, yeah, we'll see.
Okay, so
get big enough and have your community grow big enough, and you'll see what happens. But keep going.
Yeah. So in the interim, my thought on it was, okay, if I put enough minimal business logic to do SQL, the exception translation to translate any exceptions that come off of the database into my standard set, then my broker will only ever receive an internal exception type that I know and care about.
Mm-hmm.
That was how I was looking at it. Now, I think when I mentioned this to you once before, you said, yeah, you're on the right track. but I don't think it's 100%. And then this is where SPAL came from, I think, along with a few other things that were buzzing around the community at the time.
Yep.
So I've kind of got something that isn't quite the standard, but isn't quite SPAL either. I'm somewhere between the two. And I think SPAL is adding something to the standard that allows us to put business logic behind our broker by treating it as a subsystem. So let's take EF because it's a great example, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I've got a DB context and I want to depend on that in a broker,
Mm-hmm.
not make my broker the DB context, but have my broker depend on have it depend on a DB context,
Yeah.
right? I want to do it in such a way that when my service receives an exception from that DB context, it can only receive an internal exception that my library knows about. What are the rules for that? And I think this is the real answer that we're trying to figure out, isn't it? It's kind of how can we translate, much like we do with dependency injection, it's an inversion of control, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have an interface, and then we say, okay, the thing that implements it is going to depend on the interface. And then we're going to write some business logic that's also going to depend on the interface. And
Mm-hmm.
DI is going to do the wire up, right?
Yep.
By pointing the two common pieces at it.
Yep.
Okay, so I think we can do the same with exception types. My thinking was that we could have a standard set of exceptions that we consider to be acceptable
Mm-hmm.
for either a SPAL or for the standard, full stop.
Mm-hmm.
And we say, okay, these are the allowed exceptions for anything that is standard compliant code from foundation services up. Then what you can do is you can say, okay, following the standard, if I want to use something like EF, I have to wrap it up such that I have at least, say, a service sat on top of a DB context so that I can basically just do the translation work for exceptions. And then
That's what SPAL is.
Yeah, and then I can expose my interface and say, okay, that's the thing that I can consume in my business logic.
Right.
What I ended up doing was I ended up finding out things like, for example, I use query filters.
Right.
Have you ever used EF query filters?
EF query fillers?
Query filters.
Filters? No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so the idea behind EF query filters is you can specify a lambda expression.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say, when I do a get all request and I get the iQueryable for this DB set,
Mm-hmm.
and if at any point, let's say, for example, I'm including or expanding into that
Mm-hmm.
table, and therefore it's part of a subquery,
Uh-huh.
I want to apply this filter to it. It's like a where clause that I can put on there as say a security rule, for example. So what I can do is, let's say my database is multi-tenanted. I can set up my DB context with a tenant ID, and on
Mm-hmm.
every table in the database, I can apply a query filter that says where tenant ID equals the one that I've got.
Oh, like a view. Like a view?
Sort of, yeah.
Like a materialized view. Okay.
But you're doing it on the sets, and you're doing it in the EF model construction, right? So this is a key part of how I implement security down through my stack.
Right.
So imagine you've got a complex graph API in that you've got something like, let's say I'm modeling companies and their relationships to one another. You can imagine that that's a whole web of things, right?
Yep.
Now I can store those relationships in the database. So I can have a single table that contains all of my companies, for example.
Right.
But what I can then do is I can say, okay, there's a field on companies, right? And if I'm named as the owner, I can expand into child information about that
Mm-hmm.
company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what then happens is EF gives me the ability to apply these kind of complex business rules, but inside the DB context itself.
Right.
Well, according to the standard, that's not allowed. So if I was to take all of that stuff out to make my code fully standard compliant, I would have no security anywhere on my stack. And no means, for example, on the OData side, when I'm exposing my endpoints, to be able to ensure that, for example, so in our case, we are exposing transactions, and transactions live in buckets. Think of a bucket as kind of like a folder.
Yeah.
So effectively what I've got like a hierarchy or a tree of folders, essentially, for each client of ours, for each tenant. And permissions can be put on individual folders based on, attaching roles to them, essentially, and attaching users to the roles. So I've got a rule in there that says, hey, when you want to get access to, say, a list of invoices, you as an individual user have to be able to see that invoice by way of it being in a bucket that has a role that grants you invoice read privileges. You have to share that role with the bucket. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So because of this kind of complexity, what actually EF does under the bonnet is it can build a SQL query that can span all sort of 4 or 5 tables. But actually at the standard level, what I'm really talking to is a invoice broker through an invoice service, through an invoice processing service, right?
Right.
So all I care about is getting an invoice back. But actually the real question that's going on is, get me invoices where? All of this complex relationship stuff is figured out. That's my base query. And then off the top of that, I'm going to run my business logic, where my business logic will be, I'm interested in all the ones that are attached to this payment, or I'm interested in all the ones that are in this specific bucket, or it depends what the business scenario is, right?
So hang on, you can't do that. That's logic. You're putting logic in your broker.
So here's the problem, right? So this is where SPAL, in theory, comes in, because I know full well I am currently breaking the rules of the standard, but I have to in order to make my infrastructure work.
Recorded on video, witness. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. This is one thing that it is literally the only thing I can think of where I look at it and I go, the standard has no allowance for this. I don't know how to solve it. So when SPAL came up, I was sitting here like, this might solve it. So when I'm sitting here and you're asking me these questions about what should be exposed, I'm thinking, okay, I've got that piece of business logic. How can we make that piece, as I've just described, standard compliant? Well, it sounds like the answer to that is I've got my DB context. Due to the way EF works, those query filters have to be in the DB context itself. They're part of the DB context.
Right.
So I either break the standard.
Why don't you just create a subsystem and call it a logic component, like a subsystem as a logic component, and then actually write a service that validates and implements that in a test-driven fashion? Although that I'm still not fully sold on you putting the where clause down there, but if you really have to, then create a subsystem.
So think about it like this, right? Somebody wants to, a client is integrating with my API. Okay, so they issue an authentication request on a systemic account that they've set up. They get issued a token, and then they use that token to make a secure request. That token then can figure out which rows in the database entirely that client has access to. So because of the I've talked about this problem before, right? So because of the black box that EF represents, plus the black box that OData represents, and the fact that my business logic is sat in the middle and I know nothing about either end of the pipe, I've somehow got to enable at the API level an ability to expand into and crawl much of the, if you like, the graph that is represented by the API model, reflected down into the database, which has its own graph, in a secure fashion. How do you do that without implementing security at the database level and without having to separately run a query on every individual database level and override a metric crap ton of out-the-box functionality yourself? in order to remain standard compliant.
Okay,
And I
so
came to the conclusion there was no answer to that.
there is actually, and we could have like this the standard security aspect is something that Christoph been talking to me about for a while now. It's a high priority item, but
Yeah.
I still want to bring us back to this. You're talking about security.
Yeah.
I want to talk about you still gonna need to expose the native provider.
So
It's uh, since
oh,
since we're just kind of talking about you have to give your SPAL implementation a way out. It's like a fail-safe mechanism where you go and say, okay, you're this enterprise guy and you want to switch over to standardized system and you already kind of pulled in SPAL, but there's this one thing that SPAL contract doesn't give you. Why don't I give you your native provider since brokers are disposable objects anyway? As long as it doesn't impact your foundation services and maintains that the foundation service is in an abstract state.
yeah, I guess my previous argument still applies there. Is like if you need something that's not in the SPAL interface, then you don't need SPAL. You need the next level down. You need EF directly.
Right. And we're giving people access to that. The one thing that we really want to do, like actionable, like out of this discussion, because we're at the top of the hour, the one thing that I really want to press on, and then Christo, this is where you come in. We're gonna have to materialize and implement. Hey Gregory, we're gonna have to implement something that materializes the concept of SPAL. And I think we came really close. For those of you who are interested in this, this series is called the Standard Discussions. We talk about pure contracts, all that kind of stuff. But every Friday morning around 7 in the morning, we basically gather together. It's usually Christo, sometimes Paul comes in, and then there is Kin Swan. We come in and we're actually writing code towards that particular implementation.
Cool.
If you want to go back to our recorded videos, just look for standardized provider abstraction libraries. And then I'm hoping that, Krista, I don't know if I covered all the topics, but I'm hoping that we can also start talking to the community about SFAL,
Yeah.
standardized framework, provider abstraction library, which is basically framework abstraction library, basically meaning that you're not really working with the .NET framework anymore. You're working with something sitting between you and the .NET framework. Long term, we will be able to have the .NET framework as an option compared to other frameworks that still work with your C#.NET application. So today you're always saying C#.NET. It could be in the future C#X because you're not necessarily working with .NET framework anymore. Like this separation between the language and the infrastructure that's underneath the language is extremely important for the longevity of this platform.
That's going to be a huge long-term thing.
Ah, so I'm really happy that you said that because what's really happening here is that we're gonna find ourselves in a situation where we're saying, hey, slowly but surely, still give people a way in to the core framework. Get that provider, so people still have access to that. However, you're slowly but surely taking away and abstracting away functionality until you have one pure SFAL contract that basically says, here's all the models, here's all the types, here's all the routines that you can actually work with.
Mm-hmm.
It's a huge undertaking. I did say 2 years ago, we need to write our own framework. Did I say that? I did say that.
You did
And the
say
reason
that.
why I'm saying that is because, look, how are you supposed to actually validate and find out whether, you can write test-driven standardized systems if you're built on top of, semi-chaotic to chaotic systems? Like, not everything in the .NET framework is test-driven. We know that today, right? The code is out there. Go find out the tests that drive these things. There are hundreds of thousands of tests. Not all of it, does what you really expect. right? What I usually show people, and this is just so people understand, you guys do remember the validation annotations, right? They just added even more to them. The validation annotations is my favorite example about this. This is here if you go to source.net and you type in email attribute, email email validation attribute. Let's see here. It should be a class. If you look at the email attribute, so these are all the properties, and then there is the this is the system. Where is it? This is the source code of .NET, and you know, anybody can have access to that. It's not just me. And I just want to show you that there is it email model? Let's see here. Is valid. Delegate is valid transformers. If you spot email in here, it's probably it. Hold on. Unless they have removed it, then that's, yeah, email address attribute. Here it is. So if you look at this annotation, this email address, here's how it validates that an email is valid. Check this out. Thanks, Rami. Yep, that's the one.
It's got an @ sign.
Look what it's doing. It's basically saying if the value of the email is null, then that's a valid email. It's non-standardized.
I mean, to be fair, email address. What's the standard definition of an email address? I don't think there is one. Is there?
It's definitely not null, whatever that standard is. You know what
True.
this is? You know what this is saying? It's saying no human is a valid human. No dog is a valid dog. It's absolute garbage. If we really are sincere and true about following the standard and building standardized, you know, kind of a industry level systems, the stuff that we're building on top of is also chaos. Extremely chaotic. Watch this. It says here index of at. And if index of at is more than 0, that means that your email could have multiple ats in there.
Quality.
It's not quality. It's just that if you're building a system like this, first of all, this is rushed out code. I can tell you that right now. That's very rushed out code, right? Look at the comments in the middle of nowhere. Does this look like something you want to build, let's say, a spaceship on top of? Like a software that will take a spaceship to the moon or Mars? Hell no. That's why we're writing standards. There's a state of chaos that's taking over the tech industry, and we're trying to bring that together into something that makes some sense. Let's look at what the community is saying. Shinkolodian is saying, Schnickelodeon is saying, Schnickelodeon saying, does the standard already allow validation of controls before posting the request? For example, validate a text in a text box while typing. Yeah, you can do that. It's called, so validation is 3 types. There's structural and logical and external, and usually structural validations are allowed. You know, you're basically communicating to a foundation service or a view service, and it's doing that validation and coming back to you. Yes, you can.
If you do your front end the way Hassan does his front end, you've got C# on the client. So you would write standard compliance services on the client.
Yeah.
And that's before you hit your HTTP request to the server. And then you
Yep.
would revalidate, probably very similar criteria, if not the same, on the server. Probably just more robust, right?
So anyway, just coming back to this, there will be a point in time, and you guys are gonna laugh at this. There will be a point in time, and we're going to say, well, we have standardized frameworks like infrastructure. We have standardized application code that's on top of that. Let's go and standardize the hardware that we're running on top of. But that's a story for another day, right? There will be a point in time where I go and say, well, the programming language itself that you're using is not standardized, right? The programming language itself doesn't follow certain, you know, measures of being able to express and mirror some thoughts. But that's a long, like I'm talking 10 years term. We're barely just trying to get the community out of the idea of why you're not supposed to add in business logic in your controller. We're still there, right? Why we're still trying to wrap our minds around the idea of brokers and why you're not supposed to put business logic in your brokers, right? I think starting with SPAL and SFAL, and then you have standard community on top of that. I draw the diagram for you before, right? You have the standard community, and then in the middle here, you have systems because technology is getting more and more involved into people's lives. So if technology is not built right, it can cause people to die. It can cause people to true harm, financial, physical, emotional, whatever the case may be. What was that reactor that failed because people didn't test things right? What's it called? Um, you guys know the new
Hiroshima,
no, not Hiroshima, the nuclear reactor that failed and a lot of people
Chernobyl.
Chernobyl.
Yeah.
Non-standardized process caused people a lot. Have you heard about the all airlines in the United States, coming to a halt? System is not solid.
I heard about one in France going down because of their Windows 3.1 system.
3.11, yeah. Non-standardized systems, right? So anyway, we have to wrap up. We're almost, an hour and 10 in. But for our next session, which is going to be on Thursday, for the people following, this is called the standard discussion. We talk about how to properly, what's the conceptual part and think tanks about this. Um, we need to come up with actual physical material examples. I'll bring that up, Christo, and then you and I will talk about it. Paul, please join in. We'd really love your feedback there. And for anyone else, if you're in the standard community and we want to be part of this discussion, feel free to jump in, other than just engaging through the comments. But other than that, I appreciate your time. Thank you for the discussion. Christo, I hope that clarifies the whole pure contract thing. I think you and I now are on the same page.
Mm.
Brokers will have pure contracts if and only if they're relying on SPAL. If they're not relying on SPAL, then we're screwed, and your foundation service is going to have to do that mapping for us, which is what we're basically going to be doing in OpenAI. But in a way, this OpenAI.NET library, it's going to be another component that sits behind the SPAL library at some point in time, because there will be a lot of AI providers. You have that Llama thing
Yeah.
from Facebook. You have, there's many Azure Cognitive Services, ChatGPT, OpenAI, native versus the one that's with Bing. Many of them. You want a SPAL component to sit on top of all of this and say, I don't care what's underneath that's working with it. I just want to send you something and get a particular result back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, friends, cool.
So Thursday we're gonna start playing with code then.
Yes, we
For
have to. Yes. I mean, ideally, some of these discussions, some of these think tank discussions are, do we agree on the concepts? And then if we
mm,
agree on the concept, then let's prototype it. And if the prototype works, then let's standardize and productionize it. Okay, friends?
If it helps, I'm happy to share with you like my digression from the standard in my data layer, and
Go
we can
for it.
have a look at that and see,
Yep.
from your point of view, if we were to put SPAL in there, how could we make it standard compliant? Because that would be interesting for me as well to sort of learn. Hey, I know it's not standard compliant, but the trick for me at the moment is, like
Exceptions.
everyone else in the community, yeah, I'm still learning all the pieces. I'm still putting everything together, and yeah, it's a learning curve, right?
It's also true, not all the pieces are written down. I'm trying to get it out. Like literally, I'm talking to Christo right now, and I said, oh, look, this piece is not written in the standard. So an issue just gets created, and hopefully we catch up to it. Okay, friends, cool. I appreciate you all. Thanks for people who have been watching us. I'll see you tonight for the OpenAI if you can. .NET. I know it's probably 6 in the morning for you, Paul, and for you, Christos. It'll be very hard for you to kind of catch up on that. But you can catch up later on the recording and whatnot. There will be a session. I will try to fluctuate the OpenAI.net so it can catch people in different time zones. So we did it one time really early, around 9 in the morning, and then sometime in the afternoon. And then now, we do it at 10 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So we catch people in different times. Mabruk yesterday said, finally, I can catch you live because he's in Germany, all the way over there. So, now I don't know what time is it over there, but we're trying to kind of change the time zones, just to catch up with everyone live and they have a chance to engage with the community. Anyway, I appreciate you all. Thank you all so very much. See you tonight. Take care. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Christo.
Bye bye.
Bye.